Shockwaves spread across the Indo-Pacific security community when reports began emerging that 12 United States Navy warships had suddenly been surrounded by a rapidly expanding formation of Chinese naval and Coast Guard vessels in the South China Sea, triggering one of the most dangerous maritime confrontations the region has witnessed in modern times. The reports came without warning. There was no diplomatic prelude, no public ultimatum, no scheduled military exercise that could explain what was unfolding in those waters. One moment the American fleet was conducting what the Pentagon described as a routine freedom of navigation operation. The next, Chinese vessels were closing in from multiple directions, forming a tightening circle around the American formation in a move that military analysts immediately recognized as something far beyond a standard response. The deployment of 12 warships in a single formation is itself an extraordinary event. The United States Navy does not move assets of that scale into contested waters without careful planning and clear strategic intent. The presence of that many vessels in the South China Sea signaled that Washington was making a statement. But what Beijing did in response suggested that China had been waiting for exactly this moment. Within hours of the American formation entering the contested zone, Chinese naval assets began moving into position. Coast Guard cutters, People's Liberation Army Navy destroyers, and maritime militia vessels converged on the area with a speed and coordination that indicated the response had been prepared in advance. Before we go deeper into what triggered the sudden deployment of 12 US warships, how China responded to the move, and why some of the most senior military analysts in the world believe this moment could represent the most dangerous escalation the Indo-Pacific region has seen in years, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the latest updates on the most dramatic geopolitical developments happening around the world. The South China Sea has been the center of mounting tension between Washington and Beijing for well over a decade. China claims approximately 90% of those waters, a claim that has been rejected by an international tribunal, dismissed by the United States, and disputed by nearly every neighboring nation in the region. Despite those legal rulings, Beijing has proceeded to build artificial islands, install military infrastructure, and deploy naval forces across a vast stretch of ocean that serves as one of the most critical maritime corridors on the planet. Trillions of dollars in global trade pass through those waters every year. The region sits at the intersection of energy routes, shipping lanes, and strategic military positions that affect not just Asia but the entire global economy. The United States has consistently challenged China's territorial claims through freedom of navigation operations, sending warships through disputed waters to assert that international law, not Beijing's declarations, governs the sea. China has consistently condemned these operations as provocative, illegal, and destabilizing. For years, the confrontations that followed these operations remained tense but manageable. Vessels shadowed each other. Warnings were issued over radio channels. Occasionally, ships maneuvered dangerously close to one another, but the situation never escalated beyond the threshold of direct confrontation until now. What made this deployment different was not just the number of American vessels involved, it was where they were positioned. According to reports from regional security analysts, the 12 warships moved into an area that Beijing has repeatedly declared off-limits, a zone near artificially constructed installations that China considers sovereign territory. The American formation included surface combatants, support vessels, and assets that suggested this was not a simple passage through international waters. This looked to observers on both sides like a deliberate assertion of presence in a space that China has spent years militarizing and fortifying. However, that may not be the most alarming part of what unfolded. As the American formation held its position, the Chinese response began to escalate beyond what analysts had anticipated. The initial wave of Coast Guard vessels was followed by People's Liberation Army Navy destroyers moving into close proximity. Chinese military aircraft began conducting low passes over the American fleet. Communications intercepts, according to unnamed defense officials cited by regional security outlets, suggested that Chinese naval commanders were operating under instructions that went significantly higher up the chain of command than a routine intercept operation would typically require. This was not a local commander making a judgment call. The response to the American deployment appeared to be centrally directed from Beijing. Senior Chinese military officials released statements describing the American deployment as a severe provocation and a deliberate attempt to undermine Chinese sovereignty. The language used in those statements was notably sharper than standard diplomatic protest. Beijing did not frame the situation as a misunderstanding or call for dialogue. Instead, official statements warned that China would take all necessary measures to protect its territorial integrity and that American forces operating in Chinese-claimed waters did so at their own risk. Those words were carefully chosen, and military analysts around the world immediately recognized their significance. But what happened next raised new alarms entirely. Chinese state media, which operates as a direct extension of government messaging, published detailed coverage of the naval confrontation that went far beyond acknowledging its existence. State broadcasters showed footage of Chinese vessels operating in close proximity to what appeared to be American warships. Commentators on official channels described the Chinese response as a demonstration of resolve and a warning to Washington that the era of unchallenged American naval dominance in the Pacific was ending. The messaging was deliberate. It was designed not just for a domestic audience but for every government in the region watching too. See how China would respond and how the United States would react. Governments across Southeast Asia found themselves in an extraordinarily uncomfortable position. Nations like the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Indonesia all have their own territorial disputes with China in the South China Sea. They have long relied on American naval presence as a counterbalance to Chinese pressure, but they also live in China's immediate neighborhood and depend on economic relationships with Beijing that they cannot afford to sacrifice. The sight of 12 American warships surrounded by Chinese forces put every regional government in the position of having to calculate very quickly where their interests truly lay. And this is where the situation became even more complicated. Military analysts studying the formation China used to surround the American fleet noted that the positioning of Chinese vessels was not designed to simply shadow or monitor the American ships. The tactical arrangement of Coast Guard cutters and naval destroyers created a situation in which any movement by the American formation in certain directions would bring it into direct proximity with Chinese vessels. Defense experts describe this as a classic containment formation, a technique designed to limit the operational freedom of the surrounded force without firing a single shot. It was aggressive, it was calculated, and it was exactly the kind of maneuver that raises the risk of accidental escalation to dangerous levels. The United States Navy responded with its own carefully managed posture. American warships maintained their position and did not alter course in response to the Chinese formation. Pentagon officials, speaking to reporters without attribution, described the American fleet as fully capable of defending itself and stated that the ships would continue to operate in accordance with international law. The message from Washington was clear: the United States would not be moved by intimidation. But the message from Beijing was equally clear: China would not allow American forces to operate in those waters without consequence. For several hours, the world watched as two of the most powerful naval forces on Earth held their positions in an increasingly tense standoff. The strategic importance of what was unfolding cannot be separated from the broader competition between Washington and Beijing for influence across the entire Indo-Pacific region. The South China Sea is not simply a body of water, it is the central arena in which the contest for dominance between the existing global superpower and its most powerful challenger is being fought in real time. Control of those shipping lanes means control of the economic lifelines that connect the manufacturing economies of East Asia to the markets of Europe, the Middle East, and the Americas. Military presence in those waters means the ability to project power across the entire region. Both sides understand what is at stake. Neither side can afford to be seen backing down. Defense experts who spoke to regional security publications described the situation as the most dangerous naval standoff between American and Chinese forces since the EP-3 surveillance aircraft incident in 2001. Others went further, arguing that the scale of the confrontation, 12 American warships, a coordinated Chinese response involving multiple vessel types, centrally directed from Beijing, represented a qualitative shift in how China was prepared to respond to American naval operations. For years, analysts had debated when China would feel confident enough in its naval capabilities to directly confront American forces rather than simply protest and shadow. Some argued this confrontation suggested that moment had arrived. The competing narratives emerging from Washington and Beijing reflected the broader information battle that accompanies every major confrontation between the two powers. The United States framed the deployment as lawful, routine, and consistent with decades of American naval operations designed to preserve the freedom of the seas for all nations. China framed the American presence as illegal, provocative, and evidence of Washington's determination to contain and encircle the Chinese mainland. Both narratives contained elements that their respective audiences found compelling, and both narratives made resolving the standoff diplomatically significantly more difficult. Whether this confrontation marks the beginning of a new and more dangerous phase in US-China naval competition, or whether it becomes another tense episode that both sides quietly step back from, remains deeply uncertain. Military planners on both sides will analyze every detail of how the confrontation unfolded, the positioning of vessels, the communications exchanged, the decisions made at the highest levels of command, the lessons drawn from this standoff will shape the next one. For now, the 12 American warships remain in contested waters. The Chinese formation continues to hold its position, and the world watches a confrontation that neither side appears ready to back away from. Tensions remain high, analysts remain alarmed, and the question that every government in the Indo-Pacific is asking, where does this go from here, remains unanswered. Stay tuned for further updates as this developing story continues to reshape the balance of power across the most strategically critical region on the planet.